and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. My name is Cassidy Cash, and this week we're going to be taking a look at education in the 16th century. Specifically, we're going to be asking the question, did Shakespeare go to college? Short answer to this question is no, Shakespeare didn't go to college. But in arriving at that answer, I was intrigued to find out why Shakespeare hadn't gone to college and whether or not it was normal. I had always assumed that Shakespeare didn't go to college because, well, I thought they just maybe didn't go to college like they do now. And maybe it just wasn't popular. Additionally, I had always kind of thought that that line was tossed out by Shakespeare enthusiasts, especially entrepreneurs, to say things like, Shakespeare didn't get a degree, but don't let that stop you either. And while that may be true, it turns out that Shakespeare may have actually been in the minority for not getting a degree. You may know that one of his contemporaries during his lifetime, Christopher Marlowe, earned a bachelor's degree from Cambridge and was also a successful playwright of the time period. So why is it that some playwrights went to university and others did not? I decided to investigate, and here's what I found out. University education was a decidedly European invention. In fact, it came out of medieval Europe and was established as kind of the upper class educated thing to do. It was literally the school of thought. It was the source of knowledge. Often these universities were backed by inns, guilds, or even churches and religious organizations, teaching people how to think and sometimes specifically what to think. It was this idea of the world is full of information and you need to be cultured and you need to read and you need to know all of these things, but you also kind of need to support this school of thought that I adhere to. And so different universities, like today, would have different bents and different leanings. In Shakespeare's time, it was common for some of them to be more pro-Catholic than pro-Protestant or vice versa. And so different organizations that wanted to further their agenda would back these universities as a way to further their particular school of thought. Now, all of that political mumbo jumbo was mixed up with actual study of historical facts and scientific facts, arts, and literature. So the people who graduated from these universities were legitimately very well educated and very cultured in a kind of world view, not just a particular way to think, but they were knowledgeable about different schools of thought around the world. And they got more exposure to education than someone who didn't. While it is very similar to today, where it seems like successful people, some of them would go to college and some of them did not, there were two notable differences with Shakespeare's time. The first one was that it wasn't required to get a university degree to enter into a particular industry. You just had to be good at what you did. And the second, university was tied very closely to a certain social class. And we've seen that tie to social class. If you watch American classic movies, a common theme among American classic movies is that there's this girl who two guys are in love with, and one of them is kind of the cowboy type and a little bit uneducated, and the guy who is competing with him for the hand of this beautiful maiden is often a man who is labeled as a university guy, and that is pointed out to make him seem a more desirable man because he is university educated. Right? And so this analogy kind of makes Shakespeare out to be the cowboy type, which as an American, well, I love. When Shakespeare was born, there were close to 120 universities established in Europe, and there were at least 30 more which came into existence during Shakespeare's lifetime. So obviously this was a booming industry. It wasn't some little obscure thing out there on the fringes. This was something a lot of people were doing, and there was a lot of focus on university education, which got me thinking, well, if that's the case, why didn't Shakespeare go to college? Since it wasn't necessarily that it wasn't available or not done, why didn't he go? And interestingly, if you Google the statement, what college did Shakespeare attend? They'll come back and tell you that he went to King Edward VI's school, which is an error. So please pay attention to this. King Edward VI's school was a grammar school, and that's where Shakespeare went to school from age 7 until age 14. So it's not a university of college the way that you'd think of today. And so a little bit of a linguistic hiccup there with Google and that particular question. So don't Google that. Instead, let me tell you the real story. Typically, children would go to university after they completed grammar school. They'd go to grammar school through age 14. And then while there's no minimum age to go to college, the kind of average age was around 16 and 17 for when students would typically start, according to the history of Oxford University. Now, we know that Shakespeare was actually withdrawn from his grammar school at age 14 because his father ran into some serious financial trouble. So William Shakespeare didn't actually complete all of his grammar school. And because he was withdrawn, it seems that between his kind of less than upper class social standing, along with the fact that they simply couldn't afford university education, that wasn't the option for William Shakespeare. So he didn't end up going to university. And it doesn't seem like he chose to not go to university so much as that simply wasn't an option for him at the age when it was typical to go. So we can presume that it was this reality that influenced Shakespeare's decision to go into the theater industry instead. And interestingly, his grammar school focused on theater primarily in a lot of their studies. It was popular for students in the grammar school to study, memorize, recite, and perform plays from older playwrights like Socrates and Euripides. Now, yes, I know these guys were astronomers and philosophers, but they were also playwrights, and they were very good playwrights. And studying these Greek plays was a big part of Shakespeare's grammar school education. So he was literally best prepared to go into the theater when he left his grammar school. But as a fun little tidbit and look into how his plays reflect the culture of what was going on and the education focus that Shakespeare had despite his university education, I want to point out a few tidbits to you. 15th century England was the century right before William Shakespeare. We're talking about the 1400s here. And schools and colleges were really getting their foundation at this time. And they were set up attached to guilds and churches, which were supportive bodies interested in both education as well as pushing their political and social stances. Henry VI formed Eton College in 1440, and he founded King's College at Cambridge in 1441. So within 2 years, there were two major colleges launched by Henry VI, the same Henry VI that Shakespeare wrote about in his plays. One notable and very largely connected with Shakespeare, because he was used in a lot of Shakespeare's plays, all the way from the history plays of the Henrys to King Lear, was the character of Gloucester. Now, I am highly American, and my British accent, I can pretend, but I don't have an authentic British accent. So they tell me that Gloucester is the right way to say that word. It blows my little American mind that you don't pronounce the C. I don't know why you put it in there if you're not going to say it. This dude was really into the new learning. Now, the new learning was the phrase that they used before the 18th century developed the term humanism. But it was this focus on Petrarch's belief that proper education would help men live a good life, and that a good life was defined by Christ's example. Now, that explains why a lot of churches supported it, because they also believed that Christ was a good example for a moral and right way of living. In addition, humanism was a cultural movement. It was focused a lot on literature and education, which explains why Shakespeare would have a lot of humanist influences in his plays. I'm tying this back to Shakespeare's plays, I promise. So what I want you to notice is that Erasmus was one particular person from the 15th century when the colleges were getting formed that was particularly critical of the new learning. He was meeting with King Henry VIII in 1509 to criticize the new learning, and at this time became friends with a man named Thomas More. Now, Thomas More was Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor. He was a well-respected counselor to Henry VIII, and it was Erasmus who would write The Praise of Folly in 1509, dedicated to More, advocating a return to a simple form of Christianity. Apparently, they thought the humanists were a little too liberal with their application. Shakespeare references this particular controversy and his substantial knowledge of history when he writes about the Lord Chancellor in his play of Henry VIII. Now, remember that Henry VIII is Queen Elizabeth I's father, and Shakespeare is absolutely dedicated to pleasing Queen Elizabeth with his plays, because if he doesn't, Queen Elizabeth has the power to shut him down completely. And we're talking extremes here. She could have him beheaded if she doesn't like what's going on stage. So he's trying to tell a play about history, but it has strong political and social influences to try and emphasize the parts that the reigning monarchy is going to like, while de-emphasizing the parts that maybe they wouldn't care for so much. Now, being historically accurate, Thomas More was actually counselor to Henry VIII and Lord Chancellor at this time. So Shakespeare's being historically accurate in his play of Henry VIII. But in Act 3, Scene 2, the Lord Chancellor is identified as Thomas More when Cromwell is talking to Cardinal Wolsey. Now, all the other characters have gone off the stage, and it's just Cardinal Wolsey and Cromwell standing there talking. And Cardinal Wolsey is talking about how he's out of sorts, and he asks Cromwell for the latest news from abroad. And Cromwell has 2 tidbits to share with him. The first is that the king's actions are bothering Cardinal Wolsey, and that's kind of brushed over as the obvious statement. And then he says, the next is that Sir Thomas More is chosen Lord Chancellor in your place. Now, that is a very strong historical statement because basically, Henry VIII was trying to divorce Catherine of Aragon, and the church wasn't having it. And Cardinal Wolsey was removed his position of Lord Chancellor specifically because he wouldn't let Henry VIII off the hook there. And Henry VIII thought that Thomas More would. Now, later, we find out that Thomas More won't either, and Thomas More eventually ends up hung for treason. But at this point in the play, Shakespeare is reminding us of the context and saying, hey, this is when we were all happy and supportive of the Lord Chancellor. The Lord Chancellor is a good guy. And later in the play, the Lord Chancellor presides over a very important trial in this play. And so Shakespeare is kind of setting this up and kind of taking you back to before Thomas More was beheaded for treason. Interestingly, it was Thomas More who wrote the history of Richard III. His rendition of that history famously established Richard III as a tyrant and influenced Shakespeare's writing of his own Richard III later, who also villainized Richard III. As I mentioned, Humphrey, the Duke of Gloucester, was one of the few people who supported scholars, who supported literature and education, and people like Shakespeare, essentially. And in real life for Shakespeare, he was supported by the Lord Strange. When he was writing his Henry plays, it was really at the height of Shakespeare's career. He was in a can do no wrong kind of position, but mostly due to the protection of his patron, the Lord Strange, who often went to bat for Shakespeare, even to the point of a direct order from the mayor of London to shut down and stop performing. Shakespeare ignored that, and it's attributed to Lord Strange's protection and involvement that Shakespeare didn't get in more trouble than he did for ignoring that rule. The reason that's interesting is because Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had the title of Lord Protector of the Realm, and Shakespeare uses Gloucester as a type of symbol for the Lord Strange in his plays because it was the Lord Strange who protected Shakespeare's realm of the theater during the early 1590s when Shakespeare was writing these history plays. So basically, Shakespeare is showing deference and gratitude to his biggest and most powerful patron, the Lord Strange, by painting Gloucester in the plays as the saintly protective figure that Shakespeare was powerfully supported by. Now, to fully delineate this whole story and all about Cromwell and Gloucester and everyone is you could write books on this subject. In fact, in our upcoming podcast episodes, we will talk with a few of these authors who wrote such books. So you could go on and on about it, and I'm not going to delineate everything in this video, but because what I want you to take away from this lesson is that, as it turns out, the entrepreneurs who tout out this line of Shakespeare not going to university were absolutely right. Shakespeare was highly educated in literature, arts, astronomy, science, and that shows up in his plays. He's certainly powerfully knowledgeable about history and shows that in his plays as well. And so he was by no means hampered by the lack of a formal university education and was able to gain, use, and apply the same level of education in his plays, especially of like the New Learning, which is truly kind of humanist of him if you think about it. He went on to apply the same level of expertise you might get at a university without ever having to step foot in one. And so if you're sitting out there thinking, I'd like to be like Shakespeare, but I don't have a degree in it, Shakespeare is your exact example that you can achieve what you want to when you're willing to be self-educated. That's it for this week here at Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. If you liked this video, please hit like and subscribe. Every subscription that we get on this YouTube channel helps our lessons reach more people. And as you know, as Shakespeareans, we love our friends. So please hit subscribe and become our friend, and I'll see you next week. Bonus content! Thank you so much for watching this week's video all the way to the end. To celebrate your hanging in there with us for the whole episode this week, I have a bonus content hidden here at the end. It is a hand-illustrated history map called Shakespeare's Place in History. It represents all 52 years of Shakespeare's life. It shows when he wrote his plays, as well as the characters and events that were going on in his life for each year of his life. You can download that completely for free by joining that Shakespeare Girl email community, and the link for that is right down below. So look below in the comments on the YouTube video, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.